So Josh, this event is both part of the Matrix webinar series for the Critical Theory and Social Justice Department, and will be part of a college-wide first-year student COVID class. Lots of people will be listening in. And so everyone, as you come in, we'll start here in a second, and I'll start with our introduction maybe in 1 more minute. We'll be going for about an hour. More details about Q&A coming up in 1 second. Okay. All right. So let's just get started. I think that'll do. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Matrix Conversations and Transformations, which is a seminar series from the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice. I'm Professor Malik Moazzam Dolat, and I'm joined by my colleagues in the department, Professor Mary Christianakis and Professor Caroline Heldman, who's the incoming chair of the department, and who are both co-organizers of the series. So just a real quick bit about the series for those of you who this is your first time coming in. The series focuses on pressing current events and seeks to connect our community with experts, scholars, artists, the most effective activists to help us understand the causes of the problems we face and what we can do to address them. This summer, our series will address 2 main crises: the complex and far-reaching effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and political violence, in particular the violence of US police forces against Black people and its deep roots and broad effects in our society. Next week, on July 8th, we'll have Dr. William Lee to discuss nutrition, immunity, and COVID. Dr. Lee is a world-renowned physician, scientist, and New York Times bestselling author of a book, Eat to Beat Disease: The New Science of How Your Body Can Heal Itself. His research broke new ground on understanding COVID-19 and was just published in the New England Journal of Medicine. He studies food and health to understand how what we eat affects our defense and immune systems. He's authored more than 100 scientific publications and leading medical journals and textbooks. And he'll be here at noon on Wednesday of next week. I hope you'll join us. These seminars will continue throughout the summer, weekly. The registration link and description for future events, as well as video of past events, including this one, will be at oxy.edu/matrix, oxy.edu/matrix. And you can follow us and information about the program and the series at CTSJ Oxy for Instagram. We're in a Q&A format, everyone. So that means that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Ask your questions there and we'll address them over the course of the seminar, especially towards the end of the seminar. Okay, so first, let me introduce you to our guest today. We're honored to have Josh Marshal with us to discuss the 2020 election in light of political corruption, white supremacy, and police violence, as well as the pandemic. Here's a little bit about Josh. He's a journalist and writer based in New York City. He's again back in New York City. He's the editor-in-chief of Talking Points Memo, an influential political news and investigative journalism site, which he founded in 2000. He won the Polk Award for legal reporting in 2007 for his work on the politically motivated firings of the US attorneys under George W. Bush. And his journalism has appeared in numerous publications across the United States. He's built an innovative and economically sustainable journalism and media company at a time of great instability. I hope we can have him back to talk about that miracle in the future. He's a graduate of Princeton and has a Ph.D. in history with a focus on American history or early American history from Brown University. Born in St. Louis, but raised in Southern California, not too far from where we are. And he lives and works in New York City, to which he's just returned. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so we have a few questions here to get us started. So you and your team at Talking Points Memo have covered American politics rigorously and in depth for 2 decades now. And so there are many things we could talk to you about in federal politics, especially national politics. And we can broaden our scope with the audience in the Q&A if people would like. But I thought we might begin by talking about a few areas that you and TPM have covered in depth over a long period of time. Something that makes TPM special is that sort of long-term, deep coverage. And so the 3 areas I thought we'd talk about that are intertwined are these 3 important areas, I think, for TPM. Political corruption, and in this case, in the Trump administration, the public political resurgence of white nationalism and its connection to police and racist violence, and the COVID pandemic, both the federal response to it and your view of the outbreak. So we can I think these will end up being intertwined together. I don't think we can keep them separate, but let's just get started. And so, as I mentioned, you won a Polk Award for your coverage of Alberto Gonzales, the AG's firing of US attorneys. And right around the time when Attorney General Barr was confirmed and became Attorney General, you wrote that the threat of Bill Barr's lawlessness is much worse than you think. Just recently, a week ago or so ago, he fired the U.S. attorney, or tried to fire the U.S. attorney, did actually, right? Southern District of New York, but tried to replace him in a way that was beyond his legal authority. I thought we might start by asking you how you see the threat to the rule of law in the election that Barr poses. And I can prompt you in lots of ways here, the various ways in which he might interfere in the election or threaten the rule of law.
Well, I think that there has always been a tension in the American system because the chief law enforcement officer in the country is appointed by the president, in a sense works for the president, also works for the country. And that ambiguity has come up as an issue at various points in our history. But generally speaking, at least in the modern era, attorneys general and presidents have kept to the basic idea that in their law enforcement capacity, the attorney general is there to represent the country, to enforce the laws. He's not there to protect the president. He's not the president's personal lawyer. President may have an actual personal lawyer. They have the White House counsels, blah, 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 blah. What we got into in the U.S. attorney firing story back in 2007 was the White House, particular people, Karl Rove, sort of political operatives in the White House, were very big on pushing indictments about voter fraud as basically a kind of a voter suppression push that they wanted to do. And people who wouldn't cooperate with them, they fired. President has the nominal right to fire these people, but again, it's a norm that you certainly don't fire them because they're not willing to sort of prosecute your enemies. So that was a pretty big scandal in its own time, but it's been clear since President Trump has been in office that he's not just sort of trying at the margins to get the attorney general to do things helpful to him. He says openly that he sees the attorney general's job as to protect him, to protect him from the law and submit his enemies to the law. And in his first couple attorneys general, he couldn't quite get that to work. And when he found Bill Barr, it was clear that he had found someone who he saw eye to eye with. And what we have seen, over the period of Barr's tenure, again, is that norm, that tradition, that way that things are supposed to operate in this country. It has sometimes been honored in the breach, but we're no longer in honoring it in the breach. This is just how they want to do it. The legal enforcement power of the federal government is there to be a political arm of the president. Again, protect him from the law, submit his enemies to the law. And we saw that with the rollout of the Mueller report. We've seen that in the way that Barr has worked with him to sort of go after the people who investigated the president in the first place. We still don't know exactly what was going on in the Manhattan U.S. Attorney's Office. Like, why was it that they wanted to fire Jeff Berman? But because we know the people, we know that there was something that scared them, that they wanted to get rid of him. And the one thing to keep in mind with Berman This isn't some like Obama holdover. This was a Trump donor who was part of the Trump transition team. You know, he's a Trump guy, and so so that's the background there, and that is what President Trump has tried to do, looked to do, and so forth. That's out of the authoritarian playbook. That's how things work in Russia and various sort of post democracies, where you have the sort of the formal structure of civic democracy and the rule of law, but in fact, as as we've seen in Russia, that can be sort of wrenched into a de facto autocracy.
Yeah. So do you still think there's any effort? Have you seen any evidence of effort to have the sort of Burisma Ukraine investigations that Giuliani was sort of involved in funneled back through the DOJ, or is that sort of Department of Justice, or has that died down?
The Giuliani part of it, we don't really, we don't really know. We know that there are ongoing, we know that there are ongoing investigations there of Giuliani. We've never had a really clear idea of exactly what was, the dimensions of that investigation. We know that there is another investigation, the Trump, one of these kind of very long-standing things about where the money went and stuff like that. There are other investigations which seem to be tied to Deutsche Bank and, questions about, Trump adjacent banks, for lack of a better word. And then there are others that don't, there are other investigations that don't directly go to Trump, but they are probes that foreign leaders have wanted to end. There's one that has to do with the president that's related to the president of Turkey. So there's sort of no limit on the things that may have been about. And we just don't know. It's hard for us to say. We can just make a pretty strong inference, knowing the people involved, that there is some corrupt aim involved.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe we could talk about sort of the election itself. And so I think in 2004, if I remember correctly, in the presidential election, TPM covered irregularities with voting machines in Ohio, right? And then
do
I have that right?
Some of that, yeah,
a little bit, yeah. But I thought maybe we could just talk a bit about the way the Trump administration has approached, in light of the 2016 elections, defense of our voting infrastructure, if you've been following that at all, and the problem of election tampering that sort of looms over the election.
Yeah, well, this obviously, we all know kind of the backstory in 2016 with the Russian interference campaign in the election. It's not specifically the election machinery, but the social media stuff and the stealing the emails, and we know that the Russian intelligence service was at least looking at the election machinery, sort of scoping it out and looking what was in there. I think there are some legitimate suspicions, but there is no proof that anything was actually tampered with or votes were changed or anything like that. And my assumption is that is not the case, although I wouldn't say I'm sure of it. And there has been, for obvious reasons, a big push to tighten this up and make these systems more secure. And like so many other things with President Trump, he has simply resisted that, and that has been sustained by his fellow party members in Congress. Now, one adverse way of looking at that is that he wants it to happen again. So why would why would he try to make it harder? And I don't. I think it sort of speaks for himself. It speaks for itself. It's a little. It's he sees it as a kind of a zero sum game.
Yeah.
Why would he? It helped him last time. Why would he? Why would he make it harder for something that helped him the last time to happen again?
Right. So that we could, I have a number of ways I like to talk to you about that, but I've got two questions here and you can approach them however you'd like. And let me start with this one, is that how are you seeing the development of voter suppression tactics under the Trump administration, and especially, we saw like in these primary elections in Kentucky and in other places where polling stations are like very scarce in Black and minority areas. How are you seeing that at the legal level, sort of like their operation at policy level, and any movements you see to resist that?
Well, I think the sort of the 20 to 30 year perspective is helpful for this. Voter suppression, especially for targeting African Americans, especially in the South, is it's a story that goes back 150 years. It especially goes back in a kind of a new way to the post civil rights era, but it is 20. We now kind of take it as a given that the Republican Party as an institution is really against anything that makes it easier for anybody to vote, right? Early voting, mail voting, anything like that. And that particular thing is only 20 or so years old. You really see it coming out of the late 90s. It picks up after 2000. And there is an increasing recognition among Republicans that that the electorate is changing in ways that makes more voting almost always bad in partisan terms for them. And that starts a process of, various kinds of just voter suppression efforts kind of on every front. And it's funny, I was talking to, there's an expert on voting law and voting rights named Rick Hazen, who, for people who kind of follow this area, he's a very prominent voice there. And he noted to me in a conversation we had a while back that like until a decade ago, something like that. So more recently than this 20-year time frame that I'm talking about, generally speaking, whoever the official was in a given state, Secretary of State, in some cases, sometimes the governor, that generally speaking, even if that person was a Republican, that person was basically approaching their job of, it's my job to make it make it possible for as many people to vote as possible. More voting's the better. Everybody has a right to vote, blah, 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 blah. And then in the last few years, that shifted, where even at that level, sort of everybody, not just pundits and influencers and party operatives, but even the people, elected officials who were charged with this, were kind of on board of, we need to make it as hard as possible to vote. That has become even more out in the open under President Trump. And I think we can see why. There's been, I believe it's one time since 1988 when a Republican has won the majority of votes in the country. They're very invested in minority rule. And so, they have just become very open and transparent that their interests are to make it as hard to vote as possible, especially as hard for minority communities that tend not to vote Republican to vote. And, we see it in the long lines. We see it in these, you keep hearing these cases where in a certain area, there used to be, 20 voting stations, and now there's one. Some of that is a small part of that is things that we are seeing now more than we did because there's more hunger to vote. Right. And these things have been politicized, more politicized in the good sense. People are charged up to vote. They're sick of having to wait in long lines. But it's a full court press. And in some ways it's tendencies that have been in place for a couple decades that have just, in a sense, it's become more coherent and straightforward. Democrats are trying to make it as easy as possible to vote, have as many people to vote as possible, in fairness, because that does tend to help them. And Republicans are trying to do the opposite. It's one of those things, though, where even though in a sense you might say that each side is pursuing its own partisan interest, in a democracy, the side that wants to make it possible for people to vote is on the right side, even if it also helps them. So that's my take on that.
Well, that leads us right into this next question. So my memory is that you started covering the public resurgence and reemergence into the mainstream of white supremacist movements and groups long before anyone else in political journalism. I mean, obviously, there are organizations that focus on this. And you remained focused on it for years before the rise of Trumpism as such. And I think one of your colleagues, Nick Martin, I think, has started a new group on this, right? So
yes.
We should give him a plug. You can do that. So I thought maybe we could just start by tying, coming out of what we just talked about, this voter suppression movement and it's focused on minority groups. Can you talk about why you started covering what was being called at the time the alt-right so seriously and so early?
I think that, and again, as you say, it's not that we're the only one who's covered this stuff. There are various publications, but I think as a general matter, mainstream journalism has tended to see these fringe groups as not a serious part of what it means to, to cover politics. That's sort of kind of some silly, crazy stuff on the margins. And if you're really covering it in a real way, you cover the normal things, right? And some people say, well, this is just some craziness that you're into, but that's not the real story. And we have always had a sense that is much more the real story than people want to accept. And in a lot of ways, it's that stuff, militias, Tea Party stuff, kind of random Republicans you see on the news saying crazy things every so often, stuff that trends into sort of white nationalist politics and stuff, that is the engine that drives a lot of Republican politics. And so we have always thought that stuff was much more important than a lot of journalists understood. In some ways, that's the score, and sort of conventional politics is the libretto, right? The sort of the stuff on the surface, but you don't really know what's happening if you're not listening to the score. So I think that was just kind of a theory of our politics that we operated on, and I think in some ways we're vindicated in that. And probably your colleagues and listeners who have followed congressional politics through the Obama era know there was this kind of pattern where you had the sort of the nominal leaders of the Republican Party continually getting sort of upended and kind of turned crosswise by these kind of fringe figures, right? And again, that is because this underbelly of politics was pushing more and more to the surface. And really what President Trump did what was his sort of intuitive genius is to say, we don't need anymore to have a John Boehner or a Mitch McConnell be the sort of the public semi-normal voice of what we're really talking about. We're just going to say what we're really about. And that's kind of Trumpism. So Trumpism has been there. In some ways you can say it's been there for decades, but I think in a more immediate sense, Trumpism has been there for the last 10 or 15 years. It was just, it had sort of, it had this kind of tacit bargain with these mainstream Republican political figures. And that allowed people sort of not to see what was really there, not to see what was really driving the politics. So that's why this has always been something that we have followed very aggressively. And so when Trump came along, it was not a great surprise to us.
Yeah. Yeah, nor to me, because I was reading Talking Points Memo. So I guess there's two ways to talk about this, but let's start with this, which is, before we get to the election, how do you understand the relationship between Trump's open embrace, kind of an increasingly brazen embrace of the white supremacy movement or white nationalist movement, and the police violence, and in particular, it's like the New York Police Department union statements that, it came out and made some pretty disturbing statements that we saw in response to the Black Lives Matters protests following the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota. Do you see a connection there in the sort of the response in some of these police departments, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've really thought a lot about. Obviously, the police violence, police actions in minority communities, that is a long-standing story. And the political role of police unions is a long-standing story. But these things start coalescing together with Trump, and there has let me pull back and kind of make a slightly broader point. I see most of our contemporary politics as a reaction to the fact that a certain version of America, a white version of America, is being eclipsed. If you go back to as recently as my numbers, years a bit off, but back to like 1980, 1985, the country is like 80% white, or even higher than 80% white. It was basically about, the African American population of the country has been like 12 or 13% forever, basically, or for, the last century or so. And then a relatively small, numerically small number of other, non-white ethnicities, and then what we define as white people. And there is a certain kind of politics possible when it's easy to kind of, how can I put this? You can think broadly when you are the overwhelming majority, right? I mean, if there are many people who, I think, if you say in 1980, do you dislike minorities? Are you worried that minorities have too much power, stuff like this? If you are part of the majority and you make up 85% of the population, it's easy to say no. I mean, because why would you worry? You overwhelmingly dominate the society. And as that has shifted over the last few decades, that has changed things pretty dramatically. And a lot of what you see is a whole politics of resentment and fear to losing that sense of dominance, which is not only political dominance, but numerical dominance. And with policing, you've seen this, these two things again have sort of come together, the Trump story and the policing story, and the political manifestation of policing, police unions, especially since the Ferguson stuff, all these incidents that have built up over the last few years have really seemed that, that they're Trump's team, right? That sense of strong political identification. And they're two separate stories, but again, they flowed together in a very kind of toxic, dangerous way. And you see, and again, this is something that has been there for a long time, but you do see the police unions in many cases, or at least the people who speak politically for excuse me, for the police, basically, at least from my perspective, not being totally clear on who they work for. Like, do you work for us or do we work for you? Right? Because in the a lot of the stuff coming out of the NYPD unions, not just during the last 3 or 4 weeks, but in the last few years, a lot of statements about the mayor has to get out of the way, the citizens have to get out of the way and let us do our job. And you start getting the sense of like, is the police like a kind of like, are they civil servants who work for the population, or are they like a constituency with its own interests and own aims and they have all the guns or a lot of the guns? So these two things have kind of come together under Trump, and again, a way that is ominous.
Ominous is right. I'm going to leave a question, I think, on the table.
1 second. Yep.
Which is, yeah, sure.
Got it.
Which is this, that ties together the past couple of questions, which is about Trump's not so veiled threats to reject the election and the threat of racial violence, sort of like, well, police violence even in the face of protests. Let's leave that maybe for right now, because I do want to ask you one other thing here, which is, you've also covered this other story. So I want to leave time for questions. So you've covered this other story incredibly well, I think. And, I don't mean to be flattering you because you're here, but it's been really great. The pandemic story. And it isn't just that you've had really great investigative journalism, two stories in particular. One was the way in which the federal government was seizing PPE orders that the states were making. That still remains sort of vague and confusing to me what the heck was going on there. The other one is the politicization of the COVID numbers. The politicization of the COVID numbers, like how the stats are coming out. So, but before we get into that, which I strongly recommend people go to Talking Points Memo and read these stories. And also your Twitter, you have a group of experts that, a list that you've created, and that's very helpful too. But I thought your posts at the beginning of the outbreak in New York City were deeply affecting and upsetting. And you were there during the worst of it, as I recall. And so I was wondering if you could just talk about your view from New York City of that original outbreak and the response to it, and the city and the government response to it.
Yeah, and just to full disclosure, I would say I was here for the beginning of it, and then right kind of not too long after the lockdown started, my family and I were lucky enough to some friends had a cottage about an hour outside the city that they weren't using, that they invited us to use. So we were able to basically get out of the city for what was probably, I think, was the actual worst of it. And so I was sort of observing from a slight distance, but a key, but a very welcome distance, sort of mixed with a certain senses of guilt. But it's a funny thing because apart from all the numbers, if you live in Manhattan, most of us live in, pretty small apartments, right? Relative to what most people, it's compact. I mean, not that, it's a wonderful place to live, but that's just how kind of this city works. And if you're locked down, you're really locked kind of tight. In any case, it was a very weird, upsetting, jarring thing, because certainly my experience of it was kind of seeing the writing on the wall and seeing the public authorities just not reacting as quickly as they needed to. And just the resistance to closing down the city, the resistance to closing down the schools. And it really, I had, sort of nationwide, Bill de Blasio gets, no one likes Bill de Blasio, right? Everybody's always like kind of, his presidential campaign didn't go anywhere, and he comes in for a lot of ribbing. But I had always been a pretty big fan of his, because he came in with a very progressive platform, and in a matter of a year, he made those things happen. And to me, that's a good politician. You have a good platform, you come in, you do it, and whatever. But he really blew the pandemic. And in a way, it's complicated. I think at some level it is very hard. We sort of saw this all over the world. It's very hard for people to have the moral imagination to say what we saw happen in that other part of the world is about to happen here, and we need to get ahead of it. And they didn't get ahead of it. And it was bewildering and kind of terrifying to watch that unfold. The whole thing was just surreal. And I think a lot of people died who did not have to die because of those mistakes.
Yeah. So the federal response, and then some of these governors who have tied themselves to Trump, has been especially upsetting. And I wonder if, that's a big story to talk about. You can talk about it as much as you'd like, but I'm sort of interested in the way in which this irresponsible approach the federal government's taken to, obviously, that's to put it nicely, to the pandemic is tied to an electoral strategy, right? So like hiding the numbers, playing down the pandemic and all that. And I wonder if you can talk about that in some way, this strange approach to it in that way.
Yeah, I really think that this is something that I think really stems from President Trump pretty specifically and uniquely, and really it is him. Because even I think what we have seen, and I've already said, like, the mayor of New York City, who was sort of, at least originally, kind of beloved by the progressive left, he blew it in his own way. But a lot of that blowing it was not having the information, not being able to really get our heads around what was coming, what was coming down the pike. And I think with President Trump, if you look, he is really, from first to last, had two approaches to this. One is just, it's not happening. And to try to ignore it in the hope that you're going to get lucky, right? And not sure, not sure what more you can say about that. And then secondarily, to try to approach every aspect of it as who's at fault, or whose responsibility it is. And in that early phase of the epidemic, when there was, there weren't enough ventilators, uh, you should have ordered ventilators 3 years ago, or everybody agrees we're doing great with ventilators, or our stockpile is, what is this about? This is, I think he's approached it, everything is through the prism of his personal betterment, what works for him politically. And then secondarily, just, double down and hope you get lucky. And if you look at his life, his career, this has been kind of his practice, right? You kind of, you take a lot of chances and a lot of things don't work out, and you try to find other people to pick up the pieces, or you try to, kind of, really just that. You take risks, and when things don't go well, you try not to be there when things fall apart. And that is what has happened in this country. I mean, this is the epidemic is clearly, has clearly revealed deeper systemic issues that we need to deal with. Like, aren't we the richest country in the world? Aren't we the sort of, whatever issues we have with access to healthcare, we certainly have a lot of cutting edge medical technology, and we create a lot of, medicines and stuff. So how are we doing so badly? But I think fundamentally, this is just what happens when you have someone like Donald Trump. And again, in this sense, someone just looking at his history, trying to confront a crisis, and that mixture of denial and slapdashedness and taking risks and assuming someone else will pick up the pieces.
Yeah.
I really think it's that. Other things are more complicated, but that basic aspect of it, it's really him. I mean, think about it. I was writing a post a little earlier, and you have to think back that, the lockdowns in this country started basically the kind of the last week of March, kind of where it really was going nationwide. And by the first week of April, he was already saying, this is too much. We've got to reopen up. There was that stuff about got to have people back in the churches by Easter. I mean, it would be funny if it weren't so bad.
Yeah. So we have a question here from a member of the audience, Maureen Hoban. I hope I said that right, Maureen. With the amount of scandals and bad press, why does it seem nothing seems to stick to Trump, from Access Hollywood to impeachment and the Mueller report to tear gassing his own citizens? You have
I think two things. One thing, it is important to remember that from almost the first day of his presidency, President Trump has been historically unpopular. So when we say that nothing sticks, sort of everything sticks. No president has ever been this unpopular. There have been many presidents who have gotten this unpopular at some point during their presidency, but none of them have been this unpopular all the way through so consistently. So, and that's because of all these things, right? So it's not, we shouldn't feel so helpless or that these things don't matter. They are why he is so consistently unpopular. And that's not just that his approval is low, his disapproval is high. It is showing up. It's just consistent. The other thing is that I think his politics is based on a very deep resentment that I mentioned before, that is not entirely about race, but is about a portion of the country, a big minority of the country, that is very angry that they have been passed over, that they feel they are losing power that is they are entitled to. And what makes Trump what he is that very big social reality is sort of mirrored in his own personal experience. He's a resentful person. He has a desire for affection and approbation and respect that is a black hole, right? And so even though they have different origins, they kind of come together. It makes him the perfect leader of that kind of thing. And I think what that does is a lot of his supporters are not looking to him for good government. They are looking to him. It is a movement that at its deepest levels is about resentment and revenge. So a lot of the things that we see that his critics and non-supporters see as just unacceptable behavior, many of his supporters, I think, see as attacking the right people, hurting the right people. And if you see it through that prism, kind of makes more sense, right? I mean, if he's there to lash out at the people who need to be lashed out at.
Yeah, right. And so there's always a concern, I think, that the responses to that kind of politics will exacerbate that resentful base, like it sort of solidify that resentful base. How are you reading the current, Biden's campaign in response to that? Do you feel like the left, the opposition to Trump, which is now far bigger than the left,
Mm-hmm.
Are handling that properly? Do you think the discourse is moving in the right direction? Do you see dangers there in the way it's being approached?
Well, I think a few things. I think with Biden, he's been hit by some people by playing this kind of, staying on the sidelines kind of campaign. And I think he's moving off that to some extent, but that's definitely part of what he's doing. But in an election like this, the opposition does not want it to be a choice. You want it to be a referendum on the guy who's in power. And a lot of what I think Biden is doing a pretty good job. And a lot of that is just that he is letting Trump be Trump. And that is very damaging for Trump. And he is also modeling being kind of an anti-Trump, which is, I think, fundamentally what he is. Someone who is personally a decent person, is a very empathic person, and believes that you need to run the government to kind of help everybody. These are kind of platitudes, but they're good platitudes to have, right? And that is really very obviously it's the diametric opposite of what Trump is. And at some level, that is, he is modeling by his own behavior. Are you done with this? Have you had enough of this? This is terrible, right? And he's modeling that he would be a very different kind of president, which I think everybody kind of gets, right? I mean, whether you like the guy or not, he would clearly be a very different kind of president. I think there is often a thought that you need to be, it's not enough to just be against the incumbent. You need to be, kind of selling a positive vision. That's true to an extent, but again, in political terms, it's really about the incumbent. Is it good or is it not good? And that's really the only question. And in some ways, when that is the only question and the public is clearly answering it in a way that is bad for the incumbent, there's really little to be gained in changing the question, right? So I think by and large, the opposition is approaching it in the right way and sort of the sort of the only way you can do it. Now, I think what has happened in the last month or so, and this is, or at least this is my take on it, that everything that it had, one part of my pessimism about Trump's political chances has always been that, there have been a number of these episodes through his presidency where he just, he fires James Comey, he praises the neo-Nazis at Charlottesville, and everybody's, or that thing in Helsinki with Putin, and everybody thinks like, all right, he's done, it's over. But what you would see is that eventually he would just start being semi-normal again and kind of keep that up for a month or whatever. And his numbers will sort of kind of come back up, right? There's a kind of inherent buoyancy to his numbers that if he would just be semi-normal for a short period of time, he would at least go up to his normal level of unpopularity. But the thing with what has happened in 2020 is that he has suddenly confronted a series of public crises that are not fundamentally of his own making and therefore not fundamentally under his control. In those other cases, they were just crises of his own tantrums. They were just things he did, right? And so he could just stop being so crazy and kind of the crisis will be over. And in this case, the epidemic is not going away, and the economic crisis is not going away. And the protests and Black Lives Matter, it's kind of a different thing, since it's not a crisis in the same sense. It's not a bad thing in the same sense. I mean, there's nothing good. There's no upside to the pandemic. It's all horrible, right? But these are all things that he can't wish away. He can't say it doesn't exist, and suddenly you're like, okay, maybe it doesn't exist. And that has, I think, got him into this sort of like feedback loop where his inability to regain his footing, his inability to change the subject, has made him more and more desperate and taken some significant chunk of the population that was at least open-minded towards him and really turned them against him. Yeah. So, and to bring it back to your question, an election like this is fundamentally about, again, it's about the incumbent. And I think everything that how they're approaching it is basically the right way you approach it. You have to, it is fundamentally a question about the incumbent. So you need to play to that, what the reality is, especially when the reality is one in which if you ask people, a sizable majority of the country, when you ask them, have you had enough? They say, yes, right. This is not working. And so you just have to keep going with that, right?
Yeah. So Alec Ariano asked a question here, which follows here. I have heard speculation that widespread use of mail-in voting in November, if that happens, may mean that the outcome of the election will not be known on election night. Is this correct? If so, he's got a follow-up here. How might we contribute to distrust? How might it contribute to distrust of the political process? What, if anything, can the media and elected officials do to mitigate the problem?
Well, I think this is true. I think there's a very good chance that we may not have a result. Obviously, it depends on the scale. Obviously, there have been, old-fashioned elections where we weren't totally clear. But if you have lots of mail-in voting, that is a very real possibility. I think and we have to assume that if it is going against Trump, he is going to try to drive a truck through that sense of uncertainty. I think the most important thing that everybody can do, especially the media can do now, is to start educating the public that when you have lots of mail-in voting, you don't always know the outcome on election night, and that's okay. That's totally okay. That doesn't mean anybody's stealing the election. There's no, there's no rush. We just had primaries in New York State, and I may have this exact details on this is slightly off, but I think they weren't, because of the rules about when you could submit an absentee ballot, they weren't even allowed to start counting them, I think, until like a week after Election Day. So basically, very few of the races were known, and a lot of them still aren't known. I can't remember. I guess maybe they're counting them now. I don't know I'm forgetting the exact details, but the point is that that is a very real possibility. And the key thing, there is not time there is time to have an election where a lot of people mail in their votes. There is not time to get it the way they have it in states like Oregon and Washington State, where everything works perfectly and you just kind of count them in a second on election night. So there is a good chance that a lot of votes will not be counted on election night. If the election is not a blowout, that could very well mean that we have to wait a few days. So it is really critical that we educate everyone to know that that is possible and that it's okay. And once you kind of go in with that expectation, okay, we might know election night, but there's a lot of votes to count, and that's fine. But that's really key, because you saw what happened, in the Iowa caucus when there were no results and everybody was like losing their mind, right? I mean, like totally losing their mind. So to me, it's really a public education thing. We need to. It's really fine if we don't know on election night, but we need to be telling people that ahead of time, so that it doesn't. So that it doesn't set off a negative cycle of events or create some sort of crisis of public trust in the process that would be damaging in its own on its own, or give President Trump a way to sort of challenge the legitimacy of the election, which I suspect he will lose.
You expect it. So we have a minute left or so. So many people will have to go to their next meeting, because that's our lives now, next Zoom meeting. But just as a final pessimistic and sad ending here, because I don't get to ask you about the other thing I was going to ask you about, which is, what is your level of concern about Trump contesting the results of the election, maybe even in ways that are not merely like lawsuits? And how the people around him will respond.
Yeah, I have a lot of concern about that, but one thing that is really important to keep in mind is that the federal government does not run any elections. The elections are run by the states, and that is really important. That's first thing. And that means there are limits on what a president can do. And there was, I think, Biden had what I think was a very, ill-considered thing where he said, kind of, I have no doubt if Trump doesn't want to go, the military will escort him out of the White House. Well, first of all, we don't want to get into like soldiers escorting anybody out of the White House. But the reality is no one needs to escort anybody. If he wants to barricade himself in a room in the White House, like whatever, he's not president anymore. All the military has to do is no longer take orders from him. Right. There's nothing magic about being in the White House. My worry is that if it is close, I don't think he's going to lose clearly and call out the military and they're going to, cancel the election. I don't think that is going to happen. What I do worry about is a close election where there's enough ambiguity, enough issue of trying to kind of shut down vote counting that he can sort of plow something through that. I am relatively optimistic in the big picture for the reasons I said, because the mechanics of how we run elections, it's a case where the decentralization is actually a positive. But the big thing is that you want it to be a clear-cut win for Biden, unless you want Trump to win. If it is clear-cut, I don't think there's anything he can do about it. I just mechanics and the direction things are going. I just don't think that is going to happen. But it is very much in everybody's. Don't let it be close. Yeah. Don't let it go down to kind of ambiguous counts in Florida, because that could be bad.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, Josh. It's 1 o'clock. Everyone check, Josh has got a podcast. What's the name of your podcast?
It's called the Josh Marshal Podcast, surprisingly enough.
Available on all the platforms.
Yeah.
And talkingpointsmemo.com.
Yes.
Great website. And then Josh is a great follow on Twitter. Funny, as well as depressing at the same time.
Thank you.
And so please give him a follow there. Thank you so much, Josh. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.